American doughboys, like all soldiers, felt that probably the most important time of when they were in France was mail call. They wanted desperately to get letters from home. And it didn't matter so much what was written in those letters, just that they got them. It helped them connect to the world, to their home. And sometimes the letters that were sent by the parents or the people at home were about the most mundane things, like some goat having the babies or something like that. But they thought that was fantastic because it connected with them. And then they also wrote letters back. Because this was in the war zone, the letters were highly censored, and the boys knew that they weren't supposed to give much military information because the Germans could intercept it and use it. So they were very, especially in the beginning part of the war, very circumspect about what they were saying, to the point where they didn't even say where they were. Almost all the letters were addressed somewhere in France or somewhere in Luxembourg, something like that, because they wanted to make sure that they didn't give it up. They also were censored, I think, by themselves because they wanted to spare their family members and their friends the gruesome details of the war. So they kept that to themselves. But definitely the amount of military information began to grow after the armistice. And after the armistice, which ended the war, they could talk about what happened before the end of the war because it was no longer militarily significant. And the government actually suggested that there be what they call the Father's Day, and that they take time to write to their fathers on a certain day to make sure that their fathers would learn about what they did in the war. Some of the letters, a couple of them seemed to take a certain amount of insistence and importance to tell the father that they weren't injured. They'd not had been injured, but Dad, it wasn't the result of me being a coward. I don't know why I didn't get it, but I don't want you to think that your son was a coward. So they wanted to make that very clear. So that's another theme that you would see in these letters. I would like to read to you a letter from a man by the name of Paris Turner. It's a little surprising about this letter because of the time it was written and the amount of detail that was in it. So if you bear with me, I'll read this letter. He addressed it, France, September 1. I will try to answer your letter, for which I was surely glad to get. I surely consider myself lucky to be alive. We have just been in a big battle, and now we're at the rest camp, and surely need all the rest we can get. I am so tired, I can hardly walk. We had such a long, hard fight of it. Mother, you cannot imagine what an awful thing it is to take the life of another. One never thinks about it at the time, but when it is all over, it comes back to one. But it is the only way. And we entered a certain town. I saw an officer trying to get away on his horse, and I shot him with my pistol. You ought to have seen how pretty he rolled off the horse. I got his horse and the rest of his belongings and turned them over to a lieutenant. And I made up my mind, after the awful things I have seen the Germans do, that I will take no prisoners. One sees awful things here with the dead and dying and all that makes up a battle. One of the most pitiful sights I have ever seen was a boy, a mere child, in the field. I saw that he had something clutched to his breast. I looked to see what it was, and it was a Bible. And on it was written, "My son, always keep this book in your left pocket near your heart. Your loving mother. The poor kid was all torn to pieces by shrapnel. I suppose you have heard how the Germans try to work their tricks on the Yanks. They call them comrades, which means comrades. This is what the Germans typically did when they were willing to surrender. But it doesn't always mean surrender. They are always looking to play tricks on you and are apt to kill you the next time as not. When you capture them, they will fall on their knees and pray for you to spare them and then shoot you in the back the next minute. Speaking of praying, my dear mother, I think many of the boys who before the war thought little or not of all such things surely have learned that it is our comfort. When the shot and shell are flying around us, we remember the lessons Mother taught us. I surely have learned that lesson." Then he talks about he hasn't heard of a couple other boys from the Bethel area, and then he said he was sorry to learn that one of them was killed. And then he asked his mom to send him copies of the Bethel Journal so they could keep up with what was going on at home. Well, Mother, I will close, hoping to receive an answer soon. Give my love to all. Paris G. Turner, Company M6 U.S. Infantry. That was one of the more interesting letters that was written that I found. These letters were found in the newspapers that were printed in the newspapers, particularly the Clermont Courier, the Clermont Sun, the Bethel Journal, and the Milford Enterprise. So I was able to select letters from all of those. Okay. 46 men from Clermont County died. One half of them were from disease. One of them was a woman by the name of Lucy Jennings from New Richmond who died as a nurse at Camp Sherman. She died from the flu. One of the men, Archie Boyce, who was one of those in the Rainbow Division, was killed in action in France. He was buried at the Meuse-Argonne Military Cemetery to this day. And there was approximately 14,000 other American soldiers who were buried in that particular cemetery, which is the largest number in France. What was going on in Clermont County during the war, the home front? That's what we'll talk about next. The Clermont County population was about 35,000, which is amazing considering the fact that that was about the same population as during the Civil War. So Clermont lost a lot of population during that period of time. So it was about the same as during the Civil War. One of the most indelible events that happened during that period of time for the war was just the winter. The winter of 1917, 1918 was so cold and so nasty that they said it was a year without summer. Extreme cold. The papers reported 40 days below zero. The day of January the 15th, 1918 was a year that will probably be never forgotten by those who lived it. It was minus 30 degrees outside with 2 feet of snow. There's a very interesting photo in here of about 2 feet of snow in Milford on the main streets, and they had a horse-drawn plow that was plowing the streets because there was so much. Now, in those days, did not have a Duke or Cincinnati Energy. Each community had its own power plant, and most communities heated with coal. Either the electricity came from coal and the people heated from coal in their individual furnaces. The weather was so cold, the demand was up high. Weather was so cold that the tracks and the trains would freeze, the roads were freezing. People were running out of coal to keep the lights on, to keep the furnaces going. And so it was so bad that at one time the Milford Home Guard, which was mostly the men who were unable to go to war, decided they were going to hijack a train they heard that was coming through and steal a carload of coal. And they decided not to do that because they found out the coal was going up to the cartridge factory in Morrow and it would be hurting the war effort. So instead, they got together and found as many axes as possible, went around chopping up trees to give them enough wood to get through the slow period. The Red Cross was extremely busy during the war. The president of the local Red Cross was Hugh Nichols from Batavia, who was the former Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court. Most of the time, the chapters would meet at home, at ladies' homes, and during that time, they would roll bandages, they would knit socks, vests, and sweaters, and oftentimes you would read letters in the newspapers thanking the ladies because they would come through their Red Cross packages. Now, one wag, who was the editor of the Milford Enterprise newspaper, said that probably most of what happened in those meetings with all the ladies at the households was a whole lot of gossip was traded. So that was his story about what happened. They would also organize dances to raise money. One of the dances is at the Batavia Armory. They had the saxophone trio that would play these dances, and they would charge 25 cents. They also had a kind of a what they called a country store, which was running in the courthouse, when people would bring in their goods from the country, vegetables and hand goods, and sell them, sometimes resell them a couple of times to raise money, and they raised quite a bit of money with that one. But I think the most fun one was the Clermont County Fox Club, and they would actually hunt foxes in Clermont County. And this year, they named it Run the Hun. The Hun being the German name for the Germans, so it was Run the Hun. And they said that the smallest runt of the litter of foxes, they named Kaiser, which was the leader of the Germans. They also had several fundraisers in Milford and in Batavia to serve help the orphans. Can't talk about this period of time without mentioning the Spanish flu. Spanish flu actually started in Fort Riley, Kansas, is what is believed in the United States, had nothing to do with Spain. It was one of the most virulent diseases ever to hit mankind, even worse. There were more deaths in this than in the Black Plague. It's estimated somewhere between 20 and 100 million people died during the war, during that period of time. 475,000 Americans. So although we're talking about 150 or 60,000 died of the COVID virus, we still got a long ways to go. Hopefully we won't get to that point. But also remember that the population was 1/3 of what the population is today, so the impact was even greater. In Ohio, in the week of October 26, 1918, 1,500 Ohioans died in 1 week. 1 week. Life was changed, just much like what we're experiencing today. Stores were not allowed to hold sales. Funerals were postponed until it passed. Schools closed. I have here the official minutes of the Milford Exempted Village School District, which closed on December the 5th and said that they would close indefinitely. So life was altered for a significant period of time. People were trying to find ways to cure. And some of the more interesting ones, they would suggest putting a bag of camphor around your neck. Some would say cucumbers on your eyelids, turpentine, strychnine. But my favorite one was that they believed that if you went outside and took your clothes off and run around, that the germs would escape from you. I haven't heard how many people actually did that. Just kind of a scene of what was also going on. As I mentioned, tobacco was pervasive. You go everywhere, and not only smoking tobacco, but chewing tobacco. And in Clermont County courts, there was a spittoon, and it says, please don't spit on the furnace. So they didn't want to hear the popping, so that was one aspect of what was going on. Sports in Clermont County at this period of time, they had a county league baseball team league baseball that everybody followed. And one of the unique aspects was corn huskings. And during the fall, when it was time to harvest the corn, they would get out and see who could husk the most amount of corn at a particular time, and they actually had leagues around the county to do that. So I haven't seen one of those for a while. One of the most unique ways that I had read about showing your support for the war effort was a little boy by the name of Johnny Kramer. I think he was 8 or 9 years old. His father was the baker in Batavia on Main Street. His brother Paul was in the war. And observers said that they were walking through the village, and they kept hearing this little voice saying, hang the Kaiser, hang the Kaiser. And he was hanging the Kaiser in effigy. It's his way of helping his brother come home. So everybody had a way of being involved in the war and participating in this war that's a little over 100 years ago.